Hey guys, welcome back to another deep dive into the parts of history that nobody really talks about. Today we're starting a 5-part series on what life was actually like for ordinary people living under Mongol rule in China. Not the generals, not the Khans, not the grand battles that everyone loves to romanticize. We're talking about the farmers, the merchants, the craftsmen, the women grinding grain at dawn, the children playing in dusty streets while one of the largest empires in human history reorganized everything around them. Because here's the thing about the Mongol Empire. We hear endlessly about Genghis Khan and his conquests, about Kublai Khan and his pleasure dome, about the vast armies sweeping across the steppe. But something like 90+% of the people who actually lived under Mongol rule in China never swung a sword, never rode in a cavalry charge, and never set foot inside a palace. They just lived. They woke up, they worked, they ate, they worried about taxes and whether their kids would survive the winter. And their story is, frankly, just as important. So let's set the stage properly, because you can't understand daily life without understanding the world these people inhabited. When the Mongols first started pushing into northern China in the early 13th century, China was not one unified country the way we think of it today. You had the Jin dynasty controlling the north, ruled by the Jurchen people, and you had the southern Song dynasty controlling everything below the Yangtze River. These were two separate states with two separate governments, two somewhat different cultures despite their shared Chinese civilizational heritage, and two very different experiences of what was about to hit them. The Jin fell first, collapsing under Mongol pressure by 1234, though the process of conquest had been grinding on for over 2 decades before that. The southern Song held out much longer, not finally falling until 1279. That's nearly half a century of difference, which means that for people living in northern China, Mongol rule was something their grandparents had already adapted to by the time the south was still being conquered. Daily life under the Mongols was not one uniform experience. It depended enormously on where you lived, when you lived, and, frankly, what you looked like. Now, before we get into the granular details of everyday existence, we need to talk about the single most important structural reality that shaped ordinary life under Mongol rule in China, and that was the 4-class system. When Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, the first non-Han dynasty to rule all of China, by the way, he didn't just plop himself on the throne and say, "Carry on, everyone." The Mongols implemented a hierarchical classification of the entire population that divided people into 4 distinct categories. At the top were the Mongols themselves. Below them came a group called the Semu people, which was basically a catch-all category for Central Asians, Persians, Turks, and various other non-Chinese, non-Mongol groups who had allied with or been absorbed by the Mongol Empire. Third came the Han people, which in this context meant not just ethnic Han Chinese, but also Jurchens, Khittans, and other groups who had lived under the old Jin dynasty in the north. And at the very bottom were the so-called Southerners, meaning the people of the former Southern Song dynasty. Now, I need to be careful here because there's a lot of historical debate about how rigidly this system was actually enforced in practice versus how it looked on paper. Some historians argue it was a pervasive, ironclad caste system that determined every aspect of daily life. Others say it was more of an administrative framework that mattered mostly for government appointments and legal proceedings, and that in daily life, especially in rural areas, people's actual social status depended far more on wealth and local power dynamics than on which of the four categories they technically belonged to. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and it probably varied a lot from place to place and decade to decade. But the system existed, and it shaped the psychological landscape of daily life, even when its practical effects were ambiguous. If you were a southern Chinese farmer, you knew, in some abstract but real sense, that the government considered you the lowest category of person. That does something to you, even if no Mongol soldier ever shows up at your door to remind you. Let's talk about where most people actually lived, because this is where things get really mundane in the best possible way. The vast majority of people in Mongol-ruled China lived in the countryside. We're talking maybe 85 to 90% of the population. These were agricultural communities, and despite the dramatic political changes happening at the top of society, the fundamental rhythm of rural life continued in patterns that would have been recognizable to Chinese farmers for centuries before and centuries after. You planted, you harvested, you prayed for rain, but not too much rain. You repaired irrigation channels, you raised pigs and chickens, you made offerings to local gods and ancestors. The Mongol conquest didn't change the fact that rice needed to be transplanted or that wheat needed to be threshed. Nature doesn't care who sits on the throne. But the Mongol conquest did change some important things about rural life, and the biggest one was land ownership. During the initial conquests, enormous amounts of farmland were seized. Some of it was given to Mongol princes and generals as appanages, basically fiefdoms that generated income for the Mongol aristocracy. Some was allocated to Buddhist monasteries, which the Mongols generally favored. Some was turned into pasture land for horses and livestock, which was a particularly bitter pill for Chinese farmers because it meant perfectly good cropland being converted to grazing. In northern China especially, the early decades of Mongol rule saw significant depopulation and agricultural disruption. Fields that had been cultivated for generations were abandoned or converted. Entire villages disappeared. The population of northern China may have declined by somewhere between a third and a half during the worst periods of conquest and its aftermath, though the exact numbers are fiercely debated by historians. For the farmers who remained, the question of who they paid their taxes and labor obligations to became suddenly complicated. Under previous Chinese dynasties, the system was relatively straightforward. You owed obligations to the state, administered through a well-established bureaucratic apparatus. Under the Mongols, you might owe obligations to a Mongol prince who had been granted your region as an appanage, or to a monastery, or to a military garrison, or to the central government, or sometimes confusingly to multiple overlapping authorities. The Mongols initially had very little understanding of or interest in the sophisticated Chinese taxation systems that had been developed over centuries. Their instinct was much more straightforward. Take what you can, when you can, from whoever is there. Early Mongol tax collection in northern China was often rapacious and chaotic, conducted by tax farmers who had purchased the right to extract revenue from a given area, and who had every incentive to squeeze as hard as possible. This is one of those areas where the gap between the Mongol imperial court and the everyday experience of common people was absolutely enormous. Kublai Khan, sitting in his magnificent capital of Dadu, modern-day Beijing, might issue perfectly reasonable-sounding edicts about fair taxation and proper treatment of the peasantry. and those edicts might travel down through layers of bureaucracy and be completely ignored or distorted by the time they reached the local level. The person actually showing up at your village to collect taxes might be a Central Asian merchant who had paid for the privilege and who had absolutely no long-term interest in whether your community survived or thrived, only in extracting maximum value during the period of his contract. This system of tax farming was eventually reformed and curtailed, but it caused tremendous suffering in the interim, and it shaped rural people's perceptions of Mongol rule profoundly. Now, the Mongols were not stupid, and they were not purely destructive. One thing that doesn't get enough credit in popular history is how seriously the Mongol leadership, especially under Kublai Khan, eventually took the project of agricultural recovery and development. They established an office for the stimulation of agriculture. They distributed seeds and tools to farmers. They offered tax breaks to people who brought abandoned land back into cultivation. They invested in irrigation infrastructure. There was a genuine recognition, at least at the policy level, that the wealth of China depended on its agricultural productivity, and that destroying the peasantry was ultimately self-defeating. Whether these policies were motivated by genuine concern for ordinary people, or purely by self-interested revenue considerations, is a question I'll leave to the philosophers. From the perspective of a farmer receiving government-distributed seeds after years of hardship, the motivation probably mattered less than the seeds. Let me paint a more concrete picture of what a day might actually look like for an ordinary farming family in, say, the 1280s or 1290s, during the relatively stable middle period of Yuan dynasty rule. You're a household in the Yangtze River Delta region, the rice basket of China. You're classified as a southerner, the lowest of the four categories, but in practical terms, this doesn't affect your daily routine much. You live in a modest house made of wood and rammed earth, with a thatched roof. The house has maybe 2 or 3 rooms. You share it with your extended family, parents, wife, children, possibly a brother's family as well. Chinese rural households in this period tended to be multi-generational, and the Mongols actually encouraged large households because they were easier to tax as units. You get up before dawn. This is not optional and not romantic. The work needs to happen, and there's a lot of it. If it's planting season, you're out in the paddies, bent over in water up to your calves, transplanting rice seedlings by hand. This is back-breaking work. It has always been back-breaking work. It will remain back-breaking work for centuries to come. Your wife is working alongside you, or she's managing the household, cooking, weaving, tending the vegetable garden, feeding the pigs, looking after the youngest children while trying to get all of her own tasks done. Children old enough to be useful are being useful. In agricultural communities in this period, childhood as a concept of leisure and play was extremely limited. Kids worked. A 7-year-old might be watching the family's water buffalo, chasing birds away from the grain, or hauling water. Your diet is based on rice in the south, wheat and millet in the north. You eat vegetables from your garden, cabbages, beans, various greens. You eat preserved and pickled foods, especially in winter. Meat is a luxury, not a daily occurrence. Pork is the most common meat when you can get it. You might keep a few chickens for eggs. Fish, if you're near a river or lake, is an important protein source. You drink tea, which by this period is absolutely universal across Chinese society regardless of class. You probably drink some alcohol too, rice wine in the south, grain-based spirits in the north. The Mongols, for all their other cultural differences with the Chinese, had absolutely no objection to alcohol. Quite the contrary. One thing that's interesting about the Mongol period is what happened to food culture more broadly. The Mongol Empire, by connecting China to Central Asia, Persia, and even Europe through the famous Pax Mongolica, introduced new foods, new cooking techniques, and new culinary ideas. The Yuan dynasty saw the appearance of new spices, new fruits, and new recipes that reflected this extraordinary cultural exchange. A court dietary manual from the Yuan period, called the Yinshan Zhengyao, or Proper and Essential Things for the Emperor's Food and Drink, contains recipes that blend Chinese, Mongol, Turkic, and Persian culinary traditions in fascinating ways. Now, this was court cuisine, and the average farmer wasn't eating Persian-influenced lamb stew. But the broader pattern of cultural exchange did filter down to some degree. New crops, new varieties of existing crops, and new preservation techniques gradually made their way into common usage. Let's talk about clothing, because what people wore tells you a lot about their daily reality. For ordinary Chinese peasants, clothing was simple and functional. Cotton was becoming increasingly common during this period. In fact, the Yuan dynasty saw significant expansion of cotton cultivation and weaving in China, partly encouraged by Mongol policies. Before this, most ordinary Chinese people in the south wore clothes made from hemp or ramie, while northern Chinese used hemp, wool, and various plant fibers. The spread of cotton during the Mongol period was actually one of those quiet revolutions that improved ordinary people's lives in tangible ways. Cotton is warmer, softer, and more comfortable than hemp. It's easier to wash. It's easier to work with. The fact that this transformation happened under Mongol rule is one of those historical ironies that doesn't fit neatly into simple narratives of conquest and oppression. There was a political dimension to clothing as well. The Mongols had their own distinctive dress, robes that crossed to the left, tall felt hats, leather boots suited to riding. Chinese clothing traditionally crossed to the right. This might seem like a trivial detail, but in the context of the four-class system and the cultural politics of Mongol rule, the direction your robe crossed was a statement of identity. The Mongol government at various points issued regulations about clothing, hairstyles, and other markers of ethnic identity. How rigorously these were enforced at the village level is, again, debatable. But the fact that they existed tells us something about the anxieties and tensions running beneath the surface of daily life. Now, one aspect of common people's daily existence that I find particularly fascinating, and that rarely gets discussed, is the postal system. The yam, as the Mongols called it. This was not, strictly speaking, something that served ordinary people. It was an imperial communication and transportation network, a system of relay stations spaced roughly every 20 to 30 miles along major routes, staffed with horses, riders, food, and supplies. Its purpose was to allow messages and officials to travel across the vast empire with extraordinary speed. Marco Polo, if we trust his account, was amazed by it. But here's how it affected common people. The upkeep of this system was a labor obligation that fell heavily on local populations. Villages near relay stations were required to provide horses, fodder, food, labor, and housing for travelers. This could be an enormous burden. Imperial envoys and officials traveling through might demand provisions, fresh horses, and services, and refusing was not really an option. The yam was a marvel of imperial organization, but for the ordinary families supporting it, it was often just another tax, another demand on their already stretched resources. And this gets at something really important about daily life under Mongol rule that we'll explore much more in the coming parts of this series.
the gap between the grand narrative and the lived experience. The Mongol Empire connected East and West, facilitated unprecedented cultural exchange, established the largest contiguous land empire in history, and all of that is genuinely remarkable. But for the farmer whose grain was requisitioned to feed postal riders,
or whose son was conscripted for a labor corvée to build a road, or whose village was assessed an extra tax to fund a military campaign against Japan, the grand narrative was pretty irrelevant. Daily life was about survival, about navigating a system that was sometimes benevolent and sometimes brutal, about maintaining family and community bonds in a world that had been fundamentally disrupted and was still settling into its new shape. In the next part, we're going to dig deeper into urban life under the Mongols, because the cities of Yuan Dynasty China were some of the most extraordinary places on Earth, teeming with diversity, commerce, and contradictions that would make your head spin. Hashtag Part 2, Urban Life Under the Mongols, Cities of Contradictions. Let's talk about cities, because Yuan Dynasty cities were genuinely weird places. And I mean that in the most interesting possible way. When we left off, we'd been mostly thinking about the rural population, the vast majority of people living under Mongol rule in China. But the cities tell a different story, one that's messier and more colorful, and frankly, harder to summarize neatly. The cities of Yuan China were places where the Mongol imperial project collided with deeply rooted Chinese urban traditions, where Central Asian merchants rubbed shoulders with Confucian scholars, where you could find a Nestorian Christian church around the corner from a Buddhist temple around the corner from a mosque, and where the social hierarchies that the Mongols tried to impose kept getting complicated by the actual reality of how people lived and worked and made money. Let's start with the obvious one, Dadu, the capital, modern Beijing, more or less, though the Yuan city was not identical to what came later. Kublai Khan chose the site deliberately, building a new city near the old Jin dynasty capital of Zhongdu, which had been thoroughly wrecked during the Mongol conquest decades earlier. The construction of Dadu was itself a massive undertaking that tells you a lot about how the Mongol state operated. The city was planned, which is an important point. This wasn't organic urban growth over centuries. This was a deliberate act of imperial will, a city designed from scratch to serve as the capital of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The layout was based on Chinese principles of urban planning, which is interesting because it shows you how much the Mongols, despite being conquerors, relied on Chinese expertise and Chinese models for governance and administration. The city was roughly rectangular, oriented on a north-south axis, with the imperial palace complex in the center north, markets in designated areas, residential wards, and a system of broad avenues intersecting at right angles. If you've seen maps or reconstructions of Dadu, it looks orderly and rational, like someone sat down with a ruler and a compass and designed a city that would impress visitors with its scale and regularity, which is exactly what they did. The architect most commonly credited with the design was Liu Bingzhong, a Chinese advisor to Kublai, who was also a Buddhist monk and a Confucian scholar, which tells you something about the eclectic intellectual world of the early Yuan court. He drew on classical Chinese texts about ideal city planning, particularly the Caogong Ji, an ancient text that described how a royal capital should be laid out. So here you have a Mongol emperor building his capital according to ancient Chinese principles, designed by a Chinese Buddhist Confucian polymath, for a regime that simultaneously maintained the structures and sensibilities of a steppe empire. The contradictions were baked in from the beginning. The population of Dadu is hard to pin down with certainty, because medieval population figures are always a nightmare. But estimates generally range from somewhere around 400,000 to over 1 million if you include the surrounding suburbs and satellite communities. Whatever the exact number, it was enormous by the standards of the time. This was one of the largest cities on Earth, and it was absolutely packed with people from an astonishing variety of backgrounds. Marco Polo described Dadu in terms that, even allowing for his well-documented tendency toward exaggeration, suggest a place of remarkable vitality. He wrote about the constant flow of goods into the city, the enormous markets, the system of suburbs that had grown up outside the city walls to accommodate the merchants and travelers who couldn't find room inside. And this is a key point about Dadu and other Yuan cities. They were designed as nodes in a vast commercial and administrative network. The Mongols, whatever their other qualities, understood trade. They valued it, they facilitated it, and they built their cities to support it. The markets of Dadu were organized and regulated, with specific areas designated for specific types of goods. There were grain markets, livestock markets, markets for textiles, markets for luxury goods. The state maintained a system of weights and measures and attempted to regulate prices with varying degrees of success. Paper money was the required medium of exchange, which we'll get into more later because the yuan monetary system was genuinely fascinating and also eventually a complete disaster. But in the early and middle decades of the dynasty, the paper money system actually worked reasonably well, and it facilitated commerce on a scale that impressed foreign visitors enormously. But Dadu wasn't just a Chinese city. It was an imperial capital, and the Mongol presence was everywhere. The palace complex was the most obvious manifestation of this, a sprawling compound that combined Chinese architectural traditions with elements that reflected the Mongols' steppe heritage. There were parks and gardens within the palace grounds where the Khan could hunt, because hunting was an absolutely central activity for Mongol rulers. Not just recreation, but a way of maintaining martial skills and cultural identity. Kublai kept hunting preserves stocked with game, and he would go on elaborate hunting expeditions that were part sport, part military exercise, part political theater. The Imperial Guard, the Kesig, was a prominent presence in the city. These were elite military units drawn from Mongol and other Inner Asian families, and they served not just as the Khan's bodyguard, but as a kind of administrative corps, with members rotating through various governmental functions. Their presence in Dadu was a constant reminder of who was actually in charge, regardless of how Chinese the city might look from the outside. And then there were the Semu Ren, the so-called various categories of people, the catch-all term for Central Asians, Persians, Arabs, Turks, and other non-Chinese, non-Mongol people who played such an outsized role in UN administration and commerce. These communities had their own neighborhoods, their own religious institutions, their own social networks. Muslim merchants were particularly prominent, and they controlled significant portions of the long-distance trade that flowed through Dadu. There were mosques in the city, and the Muslim community was large enough and established enough to have its own legal and social structures that operated semi-autonomously within the broader framework of Yuan governance. Nestorian Christians, too, had a visible presence. The Church of the East had been active in China since at least the Tang dynasty, and under the Mongols, who were generally tolerant of religions as long as they didn't threaten political stability, Nestorian communities flourished.
There were churches in Dadu and other major cities, and some prominent Mongol families had Nestorian Christian members. Kublai's own mother, Sorgatani Beki, had been a Nestorian Christian, one of the most politically astute women of the 13th century, and her religious affiliation had not prevented her from being enormously influential in Mongol politics.
So picture Dadu as this extraordinary polyglot, multi-religious, multi-ethnic metropolis, buzzing with commerce and political intrigue, where a Confucian scholar might live down the street from a Persian astronomer, where a Mongol officer's household might include Chinese servants, Turkic concubines, and a Buddhist chaplain. It was cosmopolitan in a way that few places on earth had ever been, and that cosmopolitanism was both genuine and deeply stratified. Because for all the mixing and mingling, the social hierarchy was always present. The four-class system that the Mongols imposed meant that in any legal dispute, in any competition for official positions, in any interaction with the state, your ethnicity mattered enormously. A Mongol, or a Semu person, had structural advantages that no amount of cultural assimilation could overcome for a Chinese person, whether northern or southern. Now, Dadu was the capital, and therefore exceptional, but the pattern of diverse, commercially vibrant urban life extended to other major cities as well. Hangzhou, the former capital of the southern Song, was arguably even more impressive as a city in purely economic and cultural terms. When the Mongols conquered the Song in 1279, they inherited a city that was probably the largest and wealthiest in the world. Hangzhou had been the center of the most commercially advanced economy on Earth, and even after the conquest, it retained much of that vitality. Marco Polo called it Quinsai and described it in rapturous terms, calling it the finest and noblest city in the world. Even if we discount his numbers, which are often clearly inflated, the picture that emerges is of a city of extraordinary density and economic activity. Hangzhou was built around West Lake, with a network of canals that served as the city's transportation arteries, and its markets were legendary. Silk, porcelain, tea, lacquerware, books, paper, spices, medicines. The range and volume of goods available in Hangzhou was staggering. Under the Yuan, Hangzhou remained a great commercial center, but its character changed in subtle ways. The Mongol administration imposed its own structures, and the influx of Sumu merchants and administrators altered the demographic and cultural mix of the city. There was also the psychological dimension, which is easy to overlook, but important. For the people of Hangzhou, the Mongol conquest was a traumatic rupture. The Song dynasty had been their dynasty, their civilization, and its fall represented not just a political change, but an existential crisis. The famous painting by Gong Kai depicting an emaciated horse is widely interpreted as an allegory for the condition of Chinese scholars under Mongol rule, and that sense of cultural loss and displacement was particularly acute in former Song territory. But life went on, as it always does. The markets continued to operate, the tea houses continued to serve customers, the entertainment districts continued to attract crowds. And this brings us to one of the most interesting aspects of urban life under the Yuan, which is the explosion of popular culture, particularly theater. Yuan Zaju, the theatrical form that flourished under the Mongols, is one of the great cultural achievements of the period, and its development is directly connected to the social and political circumstances of Mongol rule. With the civil service examination system largely suspended for significant stretches of the dynasty, the traditional career path for educated Chinese men was blocked. Scholars who might have spent their lives as government officials instead found themselves at loose ends, and many of them turned to writing for the popular theater. The result was a golden age of Chinese drama, with playwrights like Guan Hanqing, Wang Shifu, Ma Zhiyuan, and Bai Pu producing works that are still performed and studied today. The plays themselves are revealing documents of social life. Guan Hanqing's The Injustice to Do-e tells the story of a young widow falsely accused of murder, a tale of judicial corruption and the suffering of ordinary people that clearly resonated with audiences living under a legal system they perceived as alien and often unjust. Wang Shifu's The Romance of the Western Chamber is a love story, but it's also a meditation on social constraints and individual desire. These weren't elite literary exercises, they were popular entertainment, performed in the Huazi, the entertainment districts of major cities, for audiences that included people from all walks of life. The Huazi themselves were fascinating institutions. These were commercial entertainment quarters where you could find theaters, storytellers, puppet shows, acrobats, fortune-tellers, tea houses, wine shops, and various other diversions. They had existed in the Song dynasty, but under the Yuan they continued to thrive and arguably became even more central to urban social life, partly because the traditional avenues of elite cultural expression were disrupted, and partly because the diverse, mobile populations of Yuan cities created a large audience hungry for entertainment. Storytelling was another crucial form of popular culture. Professional storytellers performed in tea houses and marketplaces, narrating tales of historical heroes, romantic adventures, supernatural events, and military campaigns. Many of the great Chinese novels that would later be written down in the Ming Dynasty, including Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin, had their origins in storytelling traditions that flourished during the Yuan. The storytellers worked from prompt books and outlines, but improvised extensively, adapting their tales to their audiences. And the best of them were celebrities in their own right. Let's talk about food, because food is always a window into daily life. And Yuan cities had extraordinarily diverse food cultures. The Mongol presence introduced foods and food traditions from the steppe, including a much greater emphasis on meat and dairy products than was typical in Chinese cuisine. Kumis, fermented mare's milk, was the iconic Mongol drink, and it was available in Dadu alongside Chinese wines and teas. The Yinshan Zhengyao, a dietary manual compiled by the court nutritionist Hu Sihui in 1330, is a remarkable document that reflects this culinary fusion, containing recipes that draw on Chinese, Mongol, Turkic, and Persian food traditions. There are recipes for sheep's tongue, wolf soup, roasted whole animals in the Mongol style, alongside Chinese-style preparations of vegetables and grain. In the markets, you could buy an enormous variety of prepared foods, which was important because many urban residents, particularly the poor, didn't have adequate cooking facilities and relied on street food and market stalls. This was true in Song dynasty cities as well, but the Yuan period added new layers of culinary diversity as Central Asian and Middle Eastern food traditions entered the mix. Noodles, dumplings, flatbreads, grilled meats on skewers, sweet pastries. The food markets of Dadu and Hangzhou were places of extraordinary variety. But let's not romanticize this too much. Urban life under the Yuan also meant crowding, disease, pollution, crime, and all the other problems that come with dense human settlement in a pre-modern world. Sanitation was rudimentary by modern standards. Fires were a constant threat in cities built largely of wood. Floods could devastate low-lying areas, particularly in cities like Hangzhou with their extensive canal systems. And the Mongol administration, for all its organizational capacity, was not always effective at managing these urban challenges. Crime was a significant concern, and the Yuan legal code addressed it extensively. Theft, assault, fraud, and other offenses were punished according to a system that combined Mongol customary law with Chinese legal traditions, creating a hybrid that was sometimes confusing and often perceived as inequitable by the Chinese population. The fact that punishments could differ based on the ethnicity of the offender and the victim was a constant source of resentment. If a Mongol killed a Chinese person, the penalties were typically lighter than if a Chinese person killed a Mongol, and this fundamental inequality poisoned social relations in ways that accumulated over time. The diversity of Yuan cities also created tensions that went beyond the formal ethnic hierarchy. Communities that lived side by side didn't always get along. Religious differences, commercial competition, cultural misunderstandings, all the friction points that you'd expect in a multi-ethnic urban environment were present. The Mongol policy of religious tolerance was genuine in the sense that the state didn't systematically persecute any particular faith.
But tolerance at the state level didn't prevent tensions at the local level. And there are documented cases of conflicts between different religious communities. What strikes me most about Yuan urban life is the sheer complexity of it. These were not simple places. They were layered, contradictory, vibrant, sometimes brutal, often fascinating environments, where the grand historical narratives about Mongol conquest and Chinese civilization played out in the mundane details of daily existence. A shopkeeper negotiating with a semu merchant over the price of spices. A scholar writing a play about injustice because he couldn't get a government job. A Mongol officer eating Chinese noodles in a tea house. A Muslim astronomer working at the Imperial Observatory alongside Chinese and Persian colleagues. These are the textures of daily life in one of the most remarkable urban experiments in human history. In the next part, we're going to look at the economic systems that made all of this possible, particularly the paper money system that was one of the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic monetary experiments of the pre-modern world, and the trade networks that connected Yuan China to the rest of the known world. Hashtag the Mongol Empire, Daily Life and Common People. Hashtag Part 3, Paper Promises and Silk Roads, the Economic Life of Yuan China. The thing about money is that it only works if everyone agrees to pretend it has value. This is true of gold coins, silver ingots, and cowrie shells. But the pretending is a lot easier when the money is made of something people actually want. Paper is not something people particularly want. Peter is what you wrap fish in. Paper is what you write bad poetry on. Paper is what accumulates in drifts on a bureaucrat's desk. And yet the Mongol Yuan dynasty built the largest economy in the world on the premise that pieces of paper stamped with the right symbols were worth something. They were not the first to try this. The Song dynasty had experimented with paper money, and the Jin dynasty that controlled northern China before the Mongol conquest had issued paper currency as well. But the Yuan dynasty took paper money further than anyone had before, making it the sole legal tender for an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Hungary. For a while, it worked spectacularly well. Then, as tends to happen with paper money and empires that discover they can print as much of it as they want, it stopped working. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the economic life of ordinary people in Yuan China,
you first need to understand what the economy looked like before the Mongols showed up and rearranged everything. Southern Song China in the early 13th century was probably the most commercialized society on earth. Markets were everywhere. Peasants grew cash crops, tea, sugarcane, cotton, silk, alongside their rice. Cities hummed with trade. Credit instruments, commercial contracts, and sophisticated business partnerships were commonplace. There was a functioning tax system, a reasonably efficient bureaucracy managing it, and a monetary system that combined copper coins, silver, and paper notes in a complicated but generally workable arrangement. The Mongol conquest did not destroy this economy,
but it reshaped it in ways that affected every person from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest tenant farmer. Some of these changes were deliberate policy, others were unintended consequences, and some were simply the result of what happens when you hand economic management to a ruling class whose grandparents had been nomadic herders and who regarded commerce as something other people did for you. The most immediate and visible change was the paper money system. Kublai Khan's government issued the Zhongtong Chao, the circulating treasure notes of the Zhongtong era, beginning in 1260, the year he claimed the title of Great Khan. These were not supplementary to a metallic currency. They were the currency. The government made it illegal to use gold or silver as media of exchange. If you had gold or silver, you were required to exchange it at government offices for paper notes at officially fixed rates. Copper coins, which had been the backbone of Chinese monetary systems for over 1,000 years, were also gradually pushed out of circulation. Think about what this meant for an ordinary person. A farmer bringing his grain to market, a craftsman selling pottery, a fisherman hawking his catch on the docks. All of them now conducted their transactions in paper notes issued by a foreign government. The notes themselves were made from mulberry bark paper, printed with elaborate designs that included serial numbers, denominations, official seals, and stern warnings about the penalties for counterfeiting, which included death. They came in various denominations, from small notes worth a few copper coins equivalent up to large notes representing substantial amounts of silver. They were rectangular, roughly the size of a modern sheet of letter paper for the larger denominations, and they had a lifespan. Worn-out notes could be exchanged for new ones at government offices, with a small service fee deducted. For the first few decades, the system worked remarkably well, and the reason it worked tells us something important about economic life under the Mongols. The government maintained discipline. It did not print excessive amounts of money. It backed the currency with reserves of silver and gold held in the treasury. It accepted its own notes for tax payments, which is ultimately the most important thing a government can do to support a currency's value. And it enforced the prohibition on metallic currency with sufficient vigor that people had little choice but to use the paper. Marco Polo, assuming his account reflects genuine observation, was astonished by the system. He described how the Great Khan effectively turned mulberry bark into money, and how everyone in the empire accepted it without question. "You might say," Polo wrote, or at least his ghostwriter Rustichello put in his mouth, "that he has the secret of alchemy in perfection." This was not a bad description. Turning paper into purchasing power is a form of alchemy, and like all alchemy, it works right up until it doesn't. For ordinary people engaged in commerce, the paper money system had real practical advantages.
Paper is lighter than metal.
A merchant traveling from Hangzhou to Dadu did not need to transport cartloads of copper coins or worry about bandits targeting his silver. He carried paper notes, and if those were stolen, well, that was still bad. But at least his horse wasn't collapsing under the weight. The denominations were flexible enough to handle transactions of various sizes, and the system's universality meant that a note issued in one province was valid in another, which facilitated the kind of long-distance internal trade that the yuan economy depended on. But the paper money system also created vulnerabilities that affected common people directly. Because the government controlled the money supply absolutely, any mismanagement at the top rippled down to the bottom almost immediately. When the government maintained fiscal discipline, prices were relatively stable, and a farmer who sold his rice for a certain number of paper notes could be reasonably confident that those notes would buy him the tools, cloth, and salt he needed. When the government lost discipline, as it eventually did, inflation ate the value of those notes, and the farmer found himself working just as hard for money that bought less and less. The other major economic reality of yuan life was taxation, which touched virtually every household in the empire. The Mongol tax system was, like most things Mongol, a hybrid. Different regions were taxed differently depending on when they were conquered, what systems already existed, and which Mongol prince or official happened to be in charge. In northern China, which had been conquered earlier and more thoroughly devastated, the primary taxes were land taxes assessed on households and labor service obligations. In southern China, the former Song territories, the tax system more closely resembled the Song system, with land taxes assessed based on acreage and productivity, plus various commercial taxes on trade. The household tax system in the north was based on a classification of households into different categories. Mongol households, naturally, were taxed differently, which is to say, more lightly, than Chinese households. Semu households had their own rates. Chinese households were classified by wealth into various grades, with tax obligations scaled accordingly. In theory, this was progressive taxation. In practice, the classifications were often outdated, arbitrary, or corrupt.
A household that had been wealthy when the assessment was made might have fallen on hard times, but still owed taxes based on its former prosperity. Officials responsible for assessments could be bribed to classify wealthy households in lower categories. For peasants, the most burdensome obligations were often not the direct taxes, but the corvée labor requirements. The yuan government maintained the traditional Chinese system of requiring commoners to perform unpaid labor on public works projects. This meant that a farmer might be pulled away from his fields during crucial planting or harvest seasons to work on a canal, a road, a government building, or one of the many construction projects that Kublai Khan seemed perpetually to be initiating. The Grand Canal, which connected the agricultural heartland of the south to the capital in the north, was a particular drain on labor. Maintaining, extending, and operating this waterway required enormous numbers of workers, most of them conscripted peasants who would rather have been tending their own crops. The Grand Canal was, however, central to the economic life of the empire in ways that affected everyone. The yuan capital at Dadu was located in the north, in a region that could not produce enough food to feed its enormous population. Southern China, particularly the Yangtze River Delta region, produced vast surpluses of rice. Getting that rice from south to north was one of the fundamental logistical challenges of yuan governance. The Grand Canal was one solution. Sea transport was another. The Yuan government organized massive grain fleets that carried rice up the coast from the south, a dangerous voyage that cost ships and lives every year, but moved grain in quantities that the canal alone could not handle. This grain transport system shaped economic life along its entire route. Towns along the canal thrived as transshipment points. Boatmen, dock workers, warehouse operators, canal lock tenders, and barge builders all depended on the grain trade for their livelihoods. Merchants piggybacked on the government grain shipments, moving commercial goods along the same routes. The canal towns developed their own local economies, with tea houses, wine shops, brothels, and markets catering to the transient population of boatmen and traders who passed through. For the peasants who actually grew the grain, the system was more ambivalent. On one hand, access to the canal network and to markets in general meant that they could sell surplus production for cash, or rather for paper notes. On the other hand, the government's insatiable demand for grain to feed the capital meant constant pressure to produce more, and the tax collectors who came to assess and collect were not known for their gentle touch. Tax collection in the Yuan dynasty was frequently brutal. Officials who failed to meet their quotas faced punishment, which incentivized them to squeeze taxpayers as hard as possible. Peasants who couldn't pay might have their property confiscated, be forced into bonded labor, or simply be beaten until they produced the required amount or something close to it. Beyond the domestic economy, Yuan China was enmeshed in international trade networks of unprecedented scope. The Pax Mongolica, the relative peace and security that Mongol control imposed across the vast Eurasian landmass, meant that goods, people, and ideas could move across distances that would have been impassable a century earlier. A merchant in Tabriz could, in theory, load camels with Persian carpets, travel eastward through Central Asia along routes patrolled by Mongol soldiers, and arrive in Chinese cities where those carpets would fetch premium prices. A Chinese merchant could send silk, porcelain, and tea westward along the same routes. In practice, few individual merchants made the entire journey. Trade was conducted in stages, with goods changing hands at commercial centers along the way: Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, and dozens of smaller trading towns where east met west. The Ortok system was a distinctive Mongol contribution to international commerce. Ortok partnerships were commercial arrangements in which Mongol nobles or the imperial household itself provided capital to Muslim merchants, who then used the money to conduct trade, with profits shared between the investor and the merchant. This system channeled enormous wealth into long-distance commerce and gave Muslim merchants, many of them from Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East, a privileged position in Yuan economic life. They had access to capital that Chinese merchants typically did not. They had connections to trading networks that spanned the entire Mongol Empire. And they had the implicit backing of the Mongol ruling class, which made them difficult to cheat and dangerous to cross. For ordinary Chinese people, the visible result of this international trade was the presence of foreign goods in their markets and foreign people in their cities. Spices from Southeast Asia and India, gemstones from Burma and Ceylon, horses from Central Asia, glassware from the Middle East, cotton textiles from India. These goods were not available to everyone. Most were luxury items affordable only by the wealthy, but they filtered down through the economy in various ways. A wealthy household's taste for pepper and cinnamon created demand that supported networks of spice traders, shippers, warehouse operators, and market vendors, all the way down to the dock worker who unloaded the cargo from a ship newly arrived in Quanzhou. Quanzhou, on the southeastern coast, was perhaps the most important port in the world during the Yuan period. Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants maintained permanent communities there. The city had mosques, Hindu temples, Nestorian churches, and Buddhist monasteries coexisting in close proximity. The maritime trade that flowed through Quanzhou connected Yuan China to the entire Indian Ocean trading world. Ships carrying Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea departed for Java, Sumatra, India, Persia, and East Africa. Ships arrived carrying spices, tropical hardwoods, ivory, precious stones, and aromatics. The government maintained a maritime trade superintendency in Quanzhou that regulated foreign trade, collected customs duties, and enforced the various rules governing commercial shipping. The customs duties collected at ports like Quanzhou were a significant source of government revenue, which gave the Yuan state a direct financial interest in promoting international trade. This was a notable difference from some earlier Chinese dynasties, which had viewed foreign trade with ambivalence or outright hostility. The Mongols had no Confucian qualms about commerce. They wanted revenue, and trade generated revenue, so trade was encouraged. Foreign merchants were welcomed, protected, and given legal status. The Yuan law code included specific provisions governing commercial disputes involving foreign merchants, reflecting the practical reality that international trade required a legal framework. For Chinese merchants, the Yuan period presented both opportunities and frustrations. The opportunities were real. The expansion of trade networks, the relative security of overland and maritime routes, the development of new markets. But Chinese merchants operated under disadvantages compared to their Sumu competitors. They lacked the Ortak partnerships that gave Muslim merchants access to capital and political protection. They were subject to heavier taxation, and the social hierarchy of the four-class system meant that their political influence was limited. Despite these handicaps, Chinese merchants thrived in many sectors, particularly in domestic trade, river and coastal shipping, and the retail commerce that served the empire's vast urban population. The salt trade deserves particular mention because it was one of the largest economic enterprises in the empire, and it touched virtually every household. Salt was a government monopoly. The state controlled salt production, issued licenses to salt merchants, and set prices. Salt certificates, essentially permits to buy and sell fixed quantities of salt, became a form of financial instrument in their own right, traded among merchants and sometimes used as a form of currency alongside the paper money. The salt monopoly generated enormous revenue for the government, but it also generated enormous corruption. Officials responsible for salt administration enriched themselves spectacularly. Merchants who obtained salt licenses through bribery or connections could make fortunes, and ordinary consumers paid prices for salt that included the cost of all this graft, which meant that one of the most basic necessities of life was more expensive than it needed to be. By the early 14th century, the fiscal discipline that had made the paper money system work was breaking down. The government faced mounting expenses, military campaigns, construction projects, the enormous cost of maintaining the imperial household and the Mongol aristocracy, and discovered the seductive ease of simply printing more money to cover its bills. New issues of paper currency poured out of the government printing offices. Each new issue was supposed to replace and consolidate earlier issues, but in practice, the money supply expanded faster than the economy, and prices began to rise. The inflation started gradually and then accelerated. By the 1340s, the value of paper money had declined catastrophically. Prices for basic goods, rice, cloth, salt, had multiplied many times over. Ordinary people, the farmers and craftsmen and small merchants who conducted their daily business in paper notes, watched their savings evaporate. The government tried various expedients: new currency issues, forced exchanges, price controls. None of them worked, because none of them addressed the fundamental problem, which was that the government was printing too much money. The economic crisis of the mid-14th century was not caused solely by monetary mismanagement. Natural disasters, particularly devastating flooding of the Yellow River, disrupted agriculture and displaced millions of people. Epidemics, possibly including the same plague that was ravaging Europe, killed unknown but certainly enormous numbers. But the collapse of the currency transformed these disasters from crises into catastrophes. When money loses its value, the entire web of economic relationships that holds a complex society together begins to unravel. A farmer who cannot sell his grain for money that will hold its value stops producing surplus grain. A merchant who cannot trust the currency stops extending credit. A craftsman who cannot buy raw materials stops producing goods. The economy contracts. Tax revenues decline. The government prints more money to compensate, and the spiral accelerates downward. This economic collapse was one of the primary drivers of the popular uprisings that eventually destroyed the Yuan dynasty. Hungry, desperate people whose savings had been wiped out and whose livelihoods had been destroyed were receptive to millenarian religious movements and rebel leaders who promised a new order. The Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the late 1350s and eventually produced the Ming dynasty, had its roots in the economic misery of ordinary people who had been failed by a monetary system they never fully understood and a government that had abused the extraordinary power that paper money gave it. The irony is rich and bitter. The Mongol paper money system was genuinely innovative, genuinely useful, and, for a time, genuinely successful. It facilitated commerce, unified the economy, and supported one of the most extensive trade networks in human history. And then, it destroyed the dynasty that created it, because the temptation to print money proved to be something that no medieval government, however powerful, could ultimately resist. In the next part, we will turn from economics to culture and examine what people in Yuan China actually did with their time when they were not working, paying taxes, or watching their money lose value. The arts, entertainment, religious life, and intellectual world of the Mongol period. The Mongol Empire, Daily Life and Common People, Part 4. Arts, Entertainment, Religion, and the Life of the Mind. There is a persistent and understandable temptation, when writing about the Yuan dynasty, to focus on the grand narrative, the conquests, the administration, the economic systems, the clash of civilizations. This is partly because the sources encourage it. The official histories were written by and for elites. The travelers who left accounts, Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, Odoric of Pordenone, were interested in the spectacular, the exotic, the politically significant. They wanted to describe palaces and emperors and peculiar customs, not the quiet rhythms of how a farmer's wife in Zhejiang spent her Tuesday. But people did spend their Tuesdays. They spent all of their days, in fact, doing the things that people everywhere do: eating, talking, worrying about their children, observing festivals, going to performances, praying to their gods, arguing about ideas, and finding small pleasures in a world that offered no shortage of large miseries. The cultural life of Yuan China was extraordinarily rich, and in some ways more interesting than the political life, because it is in culture that we can see the genuine complexity of what happened when Mongol rule settled over the most sophisticated civilization in East Asia. Let us begin with what people did for entertainment, because entertainment is where most people's engagement with culture actually happens, and because the Yuan dynasty produced one of the most significant developments in the history of Chinese literature, even though the literati of later centuries spent considerable energy pretending it hadn't. The development in question is Yuan drama, or zhazhu, and its rise is directly connected to the Mongol conquest in ways that illustrate how catastrophe can sometimes produce art. The examination system, as we discussed earlier, was suspended for most of the dynasty. This meant that the educated class, the scholars, the literary men, the people who had spent their entire lives preparing to write elegant, eight-legged essays and serve in the bureaucracy, suddenly found themselves with no career path, and in many cases, no income. They were educated, they were literate, they could write, and they had absolutely nothing official to do with these skills. Some of them turned to the theater. Now, drama had existed in China before the Mongols. There were performance traditions stretching back centuries: storytelling, puppet shows, variety acts, musical performances. The Song dynasty had already seen the development of sophisticated theatrical entertainment in the pleasure quarters of cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou, where performers worked in dedicated theaters called gulan or huazi. But under the Yuan, written drama achieved a level of literary sophistication it had never previously reached, because for the first time, genuinely talented writers who would otherwise have been composing poetry for imperial consumption were instead writing scripts for actors. The structure of zhazhu was quite specific. A play typically consisted of 4 acts, each built around a suite of songs in a particular musical mode. One lead character did all the singing in a given play, either the male lead or the female lead, but not both. The other characters spoke their parts in prose dialogue. There was usually a short prologue or wedge scene that set up the plot. The whole thing combined music, poetry, spoken dialogue, and physical performance in a way that has no exact equivalent in Western theatrical traditions, though opera comes closest. The content of these plays ranged widely, but certain themes recurred with striking frequency. There were courtroom dramas about unjust officials and clever judges. There were love stories, often involving scholars and courtesans. There were historical plays about famous figures from China's past. There were supernatural tales involving ghosts, gods, and magical transformations. And running through many of them, sometimes openly and sometimes just beneath the surface, was a deep preoccupation with justice, with the question of whether the world was fair, whether the powerful could be held accountable, whether an ordinary person had any hope of redress against the forces arrayed above them. This preoccupation was not subtle, and it was not accidental. These plays were written during a period of foreign conquest and social upheaval, by people who had been personally displaced from the positions they had expected to occupy, for audiences who included people from every level of society. The most famous Yuan dramatist, Guan Hanqing, That it was popular under Mongol rule is even more relevant. The Mongol authorities, whatever their other failings, did not appear to engage in systematic censorship of theatrical content, possibly because they did not take Chinese theater seriously enough to bother, or possibly because the plays, being performed in Chinese, were largely opaque to Mongol officials. Either way, the relative freedom that Yuan dramatists enjoyed is one of the more surprising features of the period. The audiences for these performances were diverse. In the large cities, Dadu, Hangzhou, Quanzhou, there were permanent theaters that could accommodate hundreds or even thousands of spectators. Performances were commercial enterprises. You paid to get in. The actors were professionals, organized into troupes, and they included both men and women, though the social status of performers was low. In the Yuan social hierarchy, entertainers were officially classified near the bottom, alongside prostitutes and beggars. This did not prevent them from being enormously popular, nor did it prevent some of them from becoming quite wealthy. It simply meant that the society's official ideology and its actual behavior were, as usual, at odds with each other. Beyond the theater, the other great popular entertainment was storytelling. Professional storytellers worked in tea houses, marketplaces, and entertainment districts, performing episodic narratives that could stretch over many sessions. These stories were the ancestors of the great Chinese novels that would emerge in later centuries: Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, Journey to the West. The Yuan period was crucial to the development of these narratives, because it was during this time that many of the oral traditions were first written down or organized into coherent cycles. The storytellers worked from prompt books that provided outlines of the plot and key passages of verse, improvising the connecting prose. Some of these prompt books survived, and they give us a rare window into a literary world that existed entirely outside the elite tradition of classical Chinese prose and poetry. Speaking of poetry, it did not stop being written under the Mongols. It could not stop being written. Poetry was so deeply embedded in Chinese educated culture that asking scholars to stop composing verse would have been like asking them to stop breathing. But the poetry of the Yuan period has a different character than what came before. There is more melancholy in it, more withdrawal, more attention to the natural world as a refuge from a political world that educated Chinese found alienating and inhospitable. The dominant poetic form of the period was the sangku, a type of lyric poetry set to the same musical modes used in drama. It was more informal, more colloquial, and more emotionally direct than the regulated verse forms that had dominated Tang and Song poetry. Many sangku poems are small, perfect expressions of mood. A scholar drinking alone on an autumn evening, watching geese fly south, contemplating the futility of ambition. They are beautiful, and they are sad, and they tell us something real about what it felt like to be an educated Chinese person living under foreign rule. Painting flourished as well, and here too the Mongol period produced work of lasting significance. The great Yuan painters, Zhao Mengfu, Huang Gongwang, Ni Zhan, Wu Zhen, are among the most revered figures in the entire Chinese artistic tradition. Their work tends toward landscape and toward a style that later critics described as emphasizing personal expression over technical virtuosity. This was partly an aesthetic choice and partly a political one. Under the Song, painting had been closely tied to the court and the academy. Under the Yuan, many of the best painters were men who had deliberately refused to serve the Mongol government. Their paintings were acts of withdrawal, assertions of cultural identity, quiet statements that even if the Mongols controlled the government and the army and the economy,
they did not control the inner life of the Chinese literati.
Zhao Mengfu is the complicated exception. He was a descendant of the Song imperial family who chose to serve the Yuan court, and he was never entirely forgiven for it by later Chinese critics. His calligraphy and painting were superb by any standard, but the question of whether a man of his lineage should have collaborated with the conquerors followed him during his lifetime and for centuries after. The debate over Zhao Mengfu is essentially a debate about the proper relationship between art and political loyalty, and it has never been fully resolved. Now let us turn to religion, because the spiritual life of Yuan China was one of its most remarkable features. The Mongol rulers practiced a policy of religious tolerance that was, by the standards of the 13th and 14th centuries, extraordinary. This was not because the Mongols were proto-secularists or Enlightenment figures born out of time. It was because the Mongols were pragmatists who were deeply superstitious about divine power and did not want to risk offending any god who might be real. Genghis Khan had reportedly said that he respected all religions and wanted to hear the prayers of all of them, on the principle that one of them might actually work. This attitude persisted through several generations of his descendants. In practice, this meant that Yuan China was home to an astonishing variety of religious traditions existing simultaneously. Buddhism was the most favored, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, which had a special relationship with the Mongol court. The relationship between the Yuan emperors and the Tibetan Buddhist clergy was one of patron and priest. The emperor provided political support and material resources, and the lamas provided spiritual guidance and religious legitimacy. Kublai Khan's relationship with the Tibetan monk Phagpa was the foundational example, and it established a pattern that would persist in Inner Asian politics for centuries. But Buddhism in China was not only Tibetan. Chinese Buddhism, in its Chan, Pure Land, and other forms, continued to function throughout the Yuan period. Monasteries operated, monks practiced, lay people donated and prayed. The relationship between Chinese Buddhist institutions and the Mongol state was generally positive, since the Mongols respected Buddhist clergy and exempted them from taxation and corvée labor, which made monastic life economically attractive in a way that was not entirely spiritual. Taoism was also present and active, though its relationship with the state was more complicated. Early in the Mongol period, the Chuanzhen school of Taoism had enjoyed considerable favor, partly because its leader, Chu Chuji, had made a famous journey to visit Genghis Khan in Central Asia and had impressed the conqueror. But the favor was not permanent. In the 1250s and 1280s, there were organized debates between Buddhists and Taoists at the Mongol court, and the Taoists lost. Partly because the Buddhists had better institutional support from the court, and partly because the debates were not exactly held on neutral ground. After losing these debates, Taoist institutions suffered some persecution, including the burning of certain Taoist texts. But Taoism as a living practice continued throughout the period, both in its institutional forms and in the popular religion that pervaded everyday life. Confucianism occupied an odd position under the Mongols. It was not exactly a religion in the Western sense, but it was the intellectual and moral framework within which the Chinese educated class understood the world. The Mongols did not suppress Confucianism, but they also did not give it the central, defining role it had occupied under previous Chinese dynasties. Confucian scholars continued to teach, study, and write, but without the examination system to give their learning practical value, Confucianism became more of a private intellectual pursuit and less of a public ideology. This was disorienting for Confucian scholars, but it was not entirely bad for Confucian thought, because it forced thinkers to engage with their tradition on its own terms, rather than as a mechanism for career advancement. And then there were the religions that had come from outside China. Islam was practiced by the significant Semu population, the Central Asians and Persians who served as administrators, merchants, and military men under the Mongols. Mosques were built in Chinese cities, and Muslim communities established themselves particularly along the trade routes and in port cities. Nestorian Christianity, which had been present in Central Asia for centuries, also had adherents in Yuan China, including some members of the Mongol elite. Catholic missionaries arrived as well. The Franciscan John of Montecorvino reached Dadu in 1294 and eventually established a small but functioning Catholic mission, complete with a church and a choir of boys singing hymns in Latin. The incongruity of Latin hymns echoing through the capital of the Mongol Empire is the kind of detail that reminds you how strange this period actually was. Judaism was also present in small communities, and there were Manichaeans and Zoroastrians as well, remnants of traditions that had traveled the Silk Road centuries earlier. The religious diversity of Yuan China was not harmony. There were tensions, competitions, and occasional conflicts between different groups. But the overall picture is one of remarkable pluralism, enforced not by ideology, but by imperial policy and commercial self-interest. A government that wanted trade to flow freely could not afford to persecute the religions of its trading partners. For ordinary people, religious life was less about doctrinal commitments and more about practical concerns. People prayed for good harvests, healthy children, recovery from illness, and protection from misfortune. They visited temples and shrines associated with local deities who might or might not fit neatly into any of the major religious traditions. They observed festivals that blended Buddhist, Taoist, and folk elements in ways that would have horrified theological purists. They burned incense and paper offerings. They consulted fortune-tellers and geomancers. They lived, in other words, in the rich, messy, syncretic religious world that has characterized Chinese popular religion for most of its history. And they did so under Mongol rule, much as they had done before and would continue to do after. In the final part of this series, we will bring these threads together and examine how Mongol rule actually ended, not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow, grinding collapse that left China transformed in ways that are still visible today. We will look at the rebellions, the plagues, the floods, and the extraordinary circumstances that produced one of the most improbable dynastic founders in Chinese history, a penniless orphan, a former Buddhist novice, and a one-time beggar who would become the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty. Hashtag The Mongol Empire in China, Daily Life and Common People. Hashtag Part 5, The Collapse. The Yuan dynasty did not fall because of a single catastrophe. It fell because of many catastrophes, arriving in overlapping waves across decades, each one weakening the foundations a little further until the entire structure gave way. And when it gave way, it was not the great lords or the Confucian scholars or the merchant princes who inherited the wreckage. It was a man who had been, at various points in his life, a destitute orphan, a novice monk, and a beggar on the roads of Anhui province. That such a person could rise to found one of China's greatest dynasties tells us something profound about how thoroughly the Mongol period had shattered the old order, and about the strange, terrible fertility of chaos. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the empire could fall, it had to rot. and the rot was both human and natural in origin. The reign of Kublai Khan's successors was characterized by a pattern that would have been grimly familiar to students of earlier dynasties: short reigns, factional infighting, and a progressive loss of central control. Between Kublai's death in 1294 and the final collapse of Mongol authority in China in 1368, 9 emperors sat on the throne. Some reigned for only a year or two. Several were murdered or deposed. The court became a theater of intrigue, in which Mongol princes, their mothers and wives, ambitious ministers, and rival cliques competed for power with an intensity that left little energy for actual governance. The fundamental problem was structural. The Mongol elite had never fully resolved the tension between their steppe traditions of collective sovereignty, in which the Khan was first among equals within a ruling clan, and the Chinese imperial model, in which the emperor's authority was theoretically absolute, and hereditary succession followed clear rules. In practice, every succession became a contest. Alliances shifted. Princes who had been passed over nursed grievances. Military commanders whose loyalty was personal rather than institutional could be bought or bullied into supporting one claimant over another. The result was a court that consumed itself in political struggle while the empire's actual problems went unaddressed. And those problems were enormous. The most visible was fiscal. The Yuan state had always spent lavishly on military campaigns, on construction projects, on the maintenance of a vast imperial household, on the Buddhist monasteries that successive emperors patronized with extraordinary generosity. Revenue, meanwhile, was chronically insufficient. The land tax system that had sustained earlier Chinese dynasties was poorly administered under Mongol rule, in part because the system of tax-exempt estates granted to Mongol nobles and religious institutions had removed vast tracts of productive land from the tax rolls. The government's response was to print more paper money, which produced exactly the result that one would expect: inflation that eroded the value of the currency and impoverished those who depended on it. By the 1340s, the paper currency had lost most of its value. This was not an abstract problem for common people. It meant that the money they received for their labor or their goods bought less and less. It meant that savings evaporated. It meant that the taxes they owed, still denominated in official currency, became simultaneously worthless and burdensome, because the government demanded payment in quantities of paper that bore no relationship to real economic value. For peasant families already living at the margins, this kind of monetary chaos could be the difference between survival and destitution. Then came the floods. The Yellow River, that ancient and terrible force in Chinese history, had been causing problems throughout the Yuan period. The river's course had shifted repeatedly, and the elaborate system of dikes and channels that previous dynasties had maintained to control it had been allowed to deteriorate. In 1344, the river burst its banks catastrophically, flooding vast areas of the North China Plain, destroying crops, drowning villages, and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. The government's response was slow, inadequate, and in some ways made things worse. When the court finally decided to undertake a massive project to redirect the river back to its former course, the effort required the conscription of enormous numbers of laborers. Peasants pulled from their fields and forced to work under brutal conditions on the dikes and channels. The conscript laborers were, by and large, exactly the people who could least afford to be taken from their land. They were farmers whose families depended on their labor for survival. They were men who had already been weakened by years of flooding, crop failure, and economic hardship, and they were furious.
The Yellow River Project of the 1350s became one of the great catalysts of rebellion, not because the project itself was unnecessary, the river genuinely needed to be controlled, but because the government carried it out in a way that seemed designed to maximize suffering. Workers were underfed, overworked,
and supervised by corrupt officials who skimmed their rations. The project became, for hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, a concrete and visceral demonstration of everything that was wrong with Mongol rule. And then there was plague. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the late 1340s, almost certainly originated in Central Asia and may have passed through China before it traveled westward along the trade routes that the Mongol peace had opened. The epidemiological history is still debated, but what is clear is that China suffered terrible epidemics in the 1340s and 1350s. The sources speak of plagues that killed tens of thousands, of villages emptied, of corpses left unburied. Coming on top of floods, famine, inflation, and political chaos, the epidemics must have seemed to many people like a sign that the cosmic order itself had broken down, that the mandate of heaven, that ancient Chinese concept of divine legitimacy, had been withdrawn from the Mongol rulers. It was in this context that the rebellions began. They started, as Chinese peasant rebellions often did, with religious movements. The most important was the Red Turban movement, which drew on a strand of popular Buddhism centered on the figure of Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, whose coming would inaugurate a new age of light and justice. The Red Turbans also incorporated elements of Manichaeism, the ancient dualistic religion that had survived in China in fragmented, syncretic forms, and of the White Lotus tradition, a devotional Buddhist movement with deep roots among the common people. The theological details mattered less than the core message. The present age was an age of darkness and suffering. A new age was coming, and those who fought to bring it about were doing sacred work. The Red Turban Rebellion erupted in 1351, initially in the Huai River region between the Yellow River and the Yangtze. Its early leaders were men like Han Shantong, who claimed descent from the Song imperial house and styled himself a messianic figure, and Liu Futong, a military leader of considerable ability. The movement spread with remarkable speed, fueled by the same grievances that had made the Yellow River labor conscription so explosive. Within a few years, Red Turban forces controlled significant territory in central China, and other rebel movements had sprung up elsewhere, some allied with the Red Turbans, some independent, some hostile to each other. The Mongol response was hampered by the same factional divisions that had paralyzed the court for decades. Different Mongol commanders pursued different strategies, sometimes fighting each other as much as they fought the rebels. Some Chinese warlords who nominally served the Yuan took advantage of the chaos to carve out their own domains. The situation devolved into a many-sided civil war in which Mongol loyalists, various rebel factions, and opportunistic regional strongmen all competed for territory and power. It was out of this chaos that Zhu Yuanzhang emerged. His story has been told many times, and it has acquired layers of legend and propaganda. He was, after all, the founder of a dynasty, and the Ming court had every reason to embellish his biography. But the basic facts are extraordinary enough without embellishment. He was born in 1328 in Anhui province, the youngest son of a desperately poor farming family. When he was 16, plague and famine killed his parents and most of his siblings. He had no money for proper burials. He entered a Buddhist monastery, not out of religious vocation, but because he had no other way to eat. When the monastery itself ran out of food, he was sent out to beg, and he spent several years as an itinerant mendicant, wandering through the countryside of central China, seeing firsthand the devastation that floods, disease, and misgovernment had wrought. In 1352, at the age of 24, he joined a local Red Turban force commanded by a minor leader named Guo Zixing. He was, by all accounts, intelligent, physically imposing, ruthless when necessary, and gifted with the ability to inspire loyalty in others. He rose quickly through the ranks. When Guo Zixing died, Zhu took over his forces. He married Guo's adopted daughter, a woman known to history as Empress Ma, who proved to be a shrewd and stabilizing influence throughout his career. What distinguished Zhu Yuanzhang from the other rebel leaders was not just his military ability, though that was considerable, but his political intelligence. He understood, earlier and more clearly than most of his rivals, that destroying the yuan was only half the problem. The other half was building something to replace it. While other rebel leaders indulged in premature declarations of kingship, fought each other over scraps of territory, or alienated the population with plunder and brutality, Zhu focused on establishing effective governance in the areas he controlled. He recruited Confucian scholars as advisors. He maintained military discipline. He set up rudimentary administrative systems. He collected taxes in an orderly fashion rather than simply looting. He presented himself not as a bandit or a millenarian prophet, but as a legitimate ruler in waiting. This was a delicate balancing act. Zhu had risen through the Red Turban movement, and he needed the support of its followers, many of whom were genuinely motivated by messianic religious beliefs. But he also needed the support of the Chinese educated elite, who regarded the Red Turban theology as dangerous nonsense. Over time, Zhu gradually distanced himself from the more radical religious elements of the movement, while retaining the loyalty of his base. It was a masterful piece of political positioning, and it helped that his rivals were often less adept at this kind of maneuvering. The 1360s were the decisive decade. Zhu's main rivals were not the Mongols, whose power in central and southern China had effectively collapsed, but other Chinese rebel leaders, particularly Chen Youliang, who controlled a large and powerful state in the Middle Yangtze region, and Zhang Shicheng, who held the wealthy Lower Yangtze area, including Suzhou. The war between Zhu and Chen Youliang culminated in the Great Battle of Lake Poyang in 1363, one of the largest naval engagements in history, in which Zhu's smaller but more maneuverable fleet defeated Chen's massive warships in a battle lasting over a month. Chen himself was killed, and his state collapsed. With Chen eliminated, Zhu turned on Zhang Shicheng, whose domain fell in 1367. By that point, Zhu controlled virtually all of southern China and had assembled the administrative apparatus of a functioning state. In January 1368, he formally declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Ming, meaning bright or brilliant, and proclaimed himself emperor. Later that year, his armies marched north and took the Yuan capital of Dadu. The last Mongol emperor, Togon Timur, fled into the steppe with his court. He did not put up a serious fight. The dynasty that Kublai Khan had founded less than a century before ended not with a heroic last stand, but with a quiet departure. What did all of this mean for ordinary people? The answer depends, as it always does, on who they were and where they lived. For those who found themselves in the path of the armies, and in a multi-sided civil war that lasted nearly 2 decades, that was a great many people. The collapse of the Yuan was a catastrophe. The fighting devastated large areas of central China, Crops were destroyed, villages were burned, people were killed, enslaved, or driven from their homes. Some regions lost half or more of their population. The Yangtze Valley, one of China's most productive agricultural areas, was particularly hard hit. For those who survived the violence, the early Ming brought both relief and new burdens. Zhu Yuanzhang, now the Hongwu Emperor, was determined to rebuild the country, and he did so with the same intensity and ruthlessness that had characterized his rise to power. He ordered massive population transfers,
dictating what different classes of people could wear, eat, and build. He was, in short, a micromanager of terrifying thoroughness, and his reign established patterns of autocratic rule that would characterize the Ming dynasty for nearly 3 centuries. But here's the thing that matters most for our purposes. The world that the Hongwu Emperor built was, in many respects, a reaction against the world that the Mongols had created. Where the Yuan had been cosmopolitan, the early Ming was xenophobic. Where the Yuan had encouraged trade and contact with the outside world, the early Ming imposed restrictions on foreign commerce and eventually banned private overseas trade altogether. Where the Yuan had maintained a multi-ethnic ruling class and had employed people of many nationalities in government, the Ming was emphatically and exclusively Chinese. The ethnic hierarchy of the Yuan, Mongols at the top, Central Asians second, Northern Chinese third, Southern Chinese at the bottom, was swept away, replaced by a system that privileged the Chinese scholar official class that the Mongols had marginalized. The Confucian examination system, which the Yuan had restored only half-heartedly and intermittently, became once again the central pathway to elite status under the Ming. The scholars who had spent decades in a kind of professional wilderness, serving as tutors, clerks, and minor functionaries because the Mongols had preferred other methods of staffing their government, reclaimed their position at the center of Chinese political and cultural life, and they wrote the histories. This is a point worth emphasizing. The official history of the Yuan dynasty was compiled by Ming scholars who had every reason to portray Mongol rule in the worst possible light, and they did so with enthusiasm. Much of what later generations believed about the Yuan period, that it was a time of unrelieved oppression, that the Chinese people suffered uniformly under the Mongol yoke, that the Mongols were barbarous and incompetent, reflects Ming-era historiography rather than the more complicated reality. The reality, as we have seen throughout this series, was that Mongol rule in China was many things at once. It was exploitative and at times brutal, particularly in its early phases and in its treatment of the southern Chinese population. It was also, for significant periods and in significant ways, a time of economic dynamism, cultural exchange, technological diffusion, and religious pluralism. Common people experienced it differently depending on their occupation, their location,
their ethnic identity, and the particular decade in question. A silk weaver in Hangzhou in the 1290s lived in a different world from a farmer on the North China Plain in the 1350s, though both lived under the same dynasty. What the Mongol period ultimately demonstrated, and what the rise of Zhu Yuanzhang confirmed in the most dramatic possible way, was the resilience and adaptability of Chinese society at its most basic levels. The village, the family, the local market, the seasonal rhythms of agriculture, the web of social obligations and customary practices that governed daily life. These things bent under the weight of conquest, but they did not break. They survived the Mongols, as they had survived earlier conquests, and would survive later ones. And when the time came, it was from these deep roots that a new order grew, planted by a man who had himself been formed in the very lowest strata of that society, who knew from personal experience what it meant to be hungry, homeless, and powerless, and who built an empire from the ruins that history had made.